What's up, everybody? It's Coach Nick, and welcome to today's Strength Training Principle video lecture on repetitions in reserve. If you look down into the description of the video, you will see a link to download both a text and a slideshow PDF document that you can use to follow along during the video lecture or just to have for your own future reference. Both the text and the slideshow have the same exact information in them. I will be following along with the slideshow presentation during this video lecture. So our lecture objectives for today, the first thing we'll do is look at what repetitions in reserve are. We will then look at how different RIR ratings look and feel during strength training. For that, we will first look at the definition of failure for this video lecture. We will then see how RIR relates to failure and then how it relates to bar/weight speed. From there, we'll be able to discuss how to utilize RIR for strength training with an example of how to use it as a progression parameter, and then another method of how you target a specific rep and reserve rating for a working set. And we will then conclude on some of the difficulties that people have in utilizing reps in reserve as a lifting tool. So repetitions in reserve represent how many more successful reps of an exercise you think you could have completed after a set before you would have reached failure. How many reps in reserve did you have left? It is a subjective rating that a lifter will try to determine themselves, and or a coach, trainer, or a lifting partner might also try to help estimate based on their observations of the weight and the lifter during the set. Before we can talk about how different reps and reserve ratings look and feel during strength training, we need to come up with a definition of failure because this is going to come up a lot in our discussion. For the purposes of this video lecture, we are going to define failure as the point at which an additional repetition cannot be successfully completed with full range of motion, safe and acceptable form, without external assistance, aka a spotter helping you or you having to dump the weight onto the safety catches. Now, repetitions and reserve and failure have a very intuitive relationship in that the lower your RIR rating is after a set, the closer to failure you were, and then the higher your repetition and reserve rating was after a set, the further away from failure that you were. And then bar/weight speed, similarly to failure, there is this same exact relationship with RIR, where the lower the rep and reserve rating is, the slower the bar and weight speed will have been, and then the more reps in reserve that you still have left, the faster the bar/weight will continue moving. Based on this, that also means that the closer to failure you are, the slower the bar/weight speed will be moving, and then the further away from failure you are, the faster the bar/weight will still be moving. So now we have those terms and those relationships determined. We can now look at how different RIR ratings look and feel during strength training. The first thing for which is failure, which I guess is technically a negative rep in reserve, and this is simply the final rep is not completed. Either your spotter helped you or the safety catches saved you. Now, 0 reps in reserve. What's important to notice here, 0 RIR is not failure. This is a repetition that would be described as a grinder. This would be a do or die effort. This repetition is going to be agonizingly slow. It's going to be at least twice as long the length to complete as the first rep of the set. It's probably going to be noticeably slower than the rep that immediately preceded it. You're probably barely going to complete this. Your spotter is going to be hovering very close to you or the bar to lend assistance at a moment's notice, and you as the lifter, you'd have had no doubt that an additional rep would not have been completable. So note, 0 RIR is not failure. 0 RIR is if you tried an additional rep, you then would have hit failure. So that is a 0 RIR rating. Next up is a 1 rep in reserve rating. Now at 1 RIR, this last rep is going to be noticeably slower than the start of the set. You might be starting to approach the territory of twice as long in length, and it's also going to be noticeably longer than the rep that preceded it, similarly to the 0 RIR rep. However, with 1 rep in reserve, this repetition will be slow, but it's not going to be nearly as agonizingly grindy, and it's not going to have the same do or die type effort to it. Your spotter's probably still going to be pretty close or poised to help you, but it's not going to be in this I need to help this person immediately type way. You as the lifter, you'd think to yourselves that an additional rep would have been risky, but probably doable, and that another rep beyond that would have been absolutely impossible. So that is 1 rep in reserve. to RIR, this repetition is still going to be slower than the start of the set. It's probably going to be slower than the rep that preceded it. And up to this point, there's probably been a gradual slowing of the bar/weight that has already begun, that is starting to compound as the lifter gets closer and closer to failure. While a 2 RIR rep would be slower, your spotter isn't going to be in the same I need to help this person immediately type position. And if you finish the set here, they probably would have told you something like, you definitely had one more in you. You as the lifter, you definitely would be confident that you definitely had at least one more. You probably would have felt confident to go for a second one, but definitely would have known a third one would have been impossible. So that is 2 reps in reserve. 3 to 4 repetitions in reserve. This is where the slowdown in bar and weight speed for most lifters is going to begin, or it's going to start becoming very noticeable at this point. While this is where the beginning of the slowdown is, you're still not very close to failure. And if you concluded the set right here, your spotter would definitely say, yeah, you had a few more in you. And you as the lifter, you also definitely would have felt that you had a few more in you. So the bar would have started to slow down a little bit somewhere at this RIR rating, but you still would be confident that you were nowhere close to failure. So then this brings us to 5+ reps in reserve. Maybe there's a little bit of bar/weight slowdown here depending on the lift that we're talking about, or whether or not it's a strong lift or a weak lift for the lifter in question. If there's any slowdown, there's not much. If you finished here, your spotter would ask you why you even asked for a spot in the first place. It would feel more akin to a warm-up effort. It doesn't really make sense to be leaving this many reps in reserve on something that is supposed to be a working or a hard set. If we're talking about something like a warm-up, if you're doing a lifting technique practice, if you're doing something like injury prevention, there's a medical condition we have to keep in mind, a high RIR rating of this could make sense. But if we're talking working/hard sets, if you're leaving 5 or more in the tank, then the set just wasn't heavy enough or hard enough, just straight up. So how can we utilize RIR for strength training? The first method is to use your rep and reserve rating as a progression parameter. This is the intuitive one where you would rate the RIR after the set was over. So a progression parameter is whatever condition you're going to set for yourself to achieve before you're going to progress some element of the lift we're talking about. To use RIR in this way as a progression parameter, you would establish that you need to have a certain number of reps in reserve after the end of the set before you're willing to increase or progress something about the setup. So one example of this would be 3 sets of 5 reps on bench press with 225 pounds. The lifter's progression parameter could be that they need to have 1+ rep in reserve remaining after they've completed the 5th rep on the 3rd set before they move on to 235 pounds. A second example, using a rep range, we can do 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps with leg extensions with 350 pounds. Maybe this lifter's progression parameters, they want 2+ RIR after achieving the upper end of the rep range. So if they're able to get to the end of the 3rd set, hit 12 reps with 150 and say, okay, I still had 2 or more left, let's bump up to 160 for either the next set or the next workout. So that's method number 1. Method number 2 is you might go into a set trying to target a specific RIR. This method is a little bit less common. It definitely demands more skill and attention of the lifter. And I think this method initially probably understood from a misunderstanding of how to use RIR, but that's my opinion, not a statement of fact. So in this method, the lifter would keep performing reps in the set until they have perceived that they are at the repetition and reserve rating that they are going for. So an example of this would be 3 sets with 225 pounds on bench press, and the lifter has the goal of just doing as many reps as it takes until they get to 1 RIR. There's no defined rep goal here. They're just going until they have achieved that intensity. Now, if we expand on this example a little bit of the 3 sets with 225, let's say they do get to 10 reps, and at 10 reps they have 1 RIR. At a certain point, they're going to say, well, I need to increase the weight, I need to have a rep goal or something. This method immediately circles back into just being the first method where you used RIR as a progression parameter. Unless you left your progression parameter undefined, which In terms of long-term strength training programming, that is never really sensible to do. If you're just trying to have an intense workout and you're trying to get close to failure, you're just really trying to push it for some reason on a given day, you could use this second method, but that would be more of an in-the-moment or short-term kind of thing. It wouldn't be sensible to have an undefined progression parameter across the long term. So now that we looked at how we can utilize RIR, we're going to look at some of the difficulties that some people have when utilizing it. Now, inexperience plays a big role in this. Obviously, the newer you are to a lift, the much harder it is for you to perceive where you are in regards to your limit on that lift. RIR is luckily a learnable skill, but it requires lifting experience and time to improve. So the less experience you have, just the harder RIR is going to be, but you can get better at it over time. The rate at which you're going to learn it, how quickly you're going to get good at RIR, that's going to be highly individualized. There's also some difficulty in the implication that in order to successfully rate RIR, which is using failure as a reference point, do you need to train to failure on a lift to be able to accurately rate RIR? Training to failure on a lift a few times deliberately, that will certainly give you the most direct representation of where failure is. You'll know exactly what weight, rep, set combination failure is equal to. So you'll know exactly where the goalpost is that you're referencing for RIR. It will also give you the body and the lift feedback that you need to be monitoring to then be able to rate RIR accurately. So you could train to failure a few times on a given lift to know for sure, but that is not a requirement. Remember, 0 RIR is not failure itself. It just means if you went for another rep, that would be failure. It's definitely possible for a lifter, even one a little bit less experienced, that with time of lifting, you can definitely hone in on what 0 RIR is without having to try to push it further and see if you really were going to hit failure or not. So again, that's going to come with a little bit of time and learning, but you don't have to lift to failure to necessarily know exactly where it is or to know exactly what 0 or 1 RIR looks like. It is just the most direct way to go about doing it. Another thing that can be difficult with RIR is that failure can sneak up on you on some exercises, so to speak. And the only way I can think to try to explain that is with an example. So a common one that this happens to me on, and I know happens to a lot of other lifters, is barbell incline bench press. We'll say the lifter had a rep range of 8 to 12, and we'll say on a given set they finished the 8th rep, and like, oh yeah, I've definitely got a few more in the tank. That was still moving quickly. I wasn't close to failing on that one. And then they go do the 9th rep, and all of a sudden, like halfway through, they hit the wall. It's all of a sudden a do-or-die grinder, and then they rack it, and they realize they didn't have another one in them. They all of a sudden went from having like 2 to 3 reps in reserve left, all of a sudden that was a maximum effort at the end, and failure was the next thing to come. When something like this occurs in a compound lift, it's usually indicating to you what the weakest link in that lift chain is. So if we're talking about the barbell incline bench press where you get it halfway up and then struggle to finish it for lockout, that's going to be your triceps, because the joint action that's missing there is tricep or elbow extension. So in this example, that's indicating to the lifter that the triceps is the weakest component of their compound pressing in this context. So that would indicate that the tricep weakness is the reason for that difficulty spike that occurs mid-rep. Now, the reason why that difficulty spike occurs, that previous rep that was not very difficult didn't seem very hard because the lifter's pecs and deltoids were probably still pretty far away from failure, at least relative to the triceps. The pecs and deltoids might have had 3+ reps in reserve left on that 8th rep, whereas the triceps might have been down to 1 or 2 because they're the weakest link in this situation. This would result in maybe the lifter not feeling as much overall fatigue because the bottom part of the lift is still probably moving pretty quickly, the pecs aren't burning yet, the shoulders aren't giving out, and because the bottom half of the lift is still moving well, the weaker triceps can probably take advantage of that bar acceleration, which might mask the fatigue or the lack of strength a little bit, and the slowdown in the rep might not manifest itself until you got onto that 9th, suddenly almost impossible rep. So that's why rep number 8 probably didn't seem anywhere close to failure. And then when they get into that 9th one, the triceps are now down to 0 or 1 rep in reserve. They're no longer able to take advantage of that momentum that the bottom part of the lift has generated, and then all of a sudden that top half is nearly impossible. So that's what happens in the barbell incline example. That type of thinking and framework can also be extrapolated to other compound lifts. Now, when this occurs in isolation lifts, it is mostly due to the fact that in isolation lifts you're using a smaller number and or smaller muscles to do the exercise. On these types of lift, fatigue accumulates at an increasing rate the closer to failure you get. So when you're at 3 reps in reserve, the amount of fatigue that accumulates between 3 to 2 is less than from 2 to 1, and then 2 to 1 is less than the amount of fatigue that accumulates from 1 to 0. So it builds more exponentially like that. So if you're doing a lift like barbell curls or leg extensions, you could get to the 8th rep, and then all of a sudden the 8th rep you could think you have 3 or 4 left. Then you do the 9th one, you might realize you're only down to 1 or 2, and then you do the 10th one, you realize you're done. So that fatigue kind of builds up on you more quickly the closer you get to the end. And then lastly, the closer you get to failure, the more fatigued you're going to be. Technique will sometimes break down with increasing fatigue, and the technical breakdown can account for the difficulty spike in between repetitions. Now, the last difficulty here is some lifters are just really bad at self-rating their performances, and this can include very advanced lifters who have performed decades of lifting and thousands of reps on exercises. Sometimes they are still bad at using reps in reserve. Some people just aren't good at using it because they just can't self-rate performance, and that's just how it is. If you're a lifter that falls into that camp, the thing you're going to be monitoring then is you're going to be paying a lot of attention to bar/weight speed. You're going to be paying a lot of attention to your form to be monitoring for technical breakdowns. And you're also probably going to try to be getting really in tune with the idea of the muscle burn. That is going to be your closest approximation to an RIR. So you're going to need to be focusing on these other things rather than trying to come up with a specific rating if you're not that good at rating self-performance like that. So one important note to make before we finish up, all of the progress and numbers we were talking about in this video lecture are completely hypothetical to make repetitions in reserve easy to talk about. Your own progress and successful usage of RIR is going to depend on a lot of things, like if you're a good self-rater of performance. And then it's also going to depend on your age, biological sex, training status and experience, training intensity, consistency, nutrition, recovery habits, all that kind of stuff. So that will conclude everything that we're going to talk about today for repetitions in reserve. If you found this video to be enjoyable or educational, please give it a like. If you have any questions about anything that I discuss in the video, feel free to leave that question as a comment below. Or if there's anything that you'd like to discuss further, feel free to comment that as well. If this type of educational content appeals to you and you'd like to see more, feel free to subscribe to the channel. This has been Coach Nick, and I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.